The candles in the corridor had burned dangerously low, their flames guttering in pools of wax that would need replacing before dawn. Mildred quickened her pace despite the ache in her legs, her gray skirts whispering against the cold stone floor. The castle's oppressive silence pressed against her ears. No sound but the distant drip of water somewhere in the depths and her own rapid breathing. She should have checked on Josh an hour ago. Her white cap sat slightly askew on her dark hair, knocked loose during her hurried climb up the servants' staircase. The head housekeeper had detained her with endless instructions about the Vampire King's impending court assembly, and Mildred had nodded through it all while her mind screamed that she needed to be with the boy. Josh hated the evening hours when shadows grew long and the castle's true inhabitants began to stir. The east wing stretched before her like the throat of some great beast. Tall windows on her left, filtering in the last gray light of dusk. Mildred clutched her woolen shawl tighter, though the cold she felt had nothing to do with temperature. 6 months she'd worked in Castle Noctis, and still her skin prickled whenever she walked these halls alone. The portraits of long-dead nobility seemed to watch her pass, their eyes holding secrets and hunger in equal measure. She'd been desperate when she took this position, fleeing debts and darker memories in the villages below, willing to work anywhere that would take a woman with no references and a past she couldn't explain. They said the Vampire King paid well and asked a few questions. They hadn't mentioned the price of sleep, or how every morning she would count the servants at breakfast and wonder who might not return from the night shift. But then there was Josh. Mildred's pace slowed as she approached his chamber door, her hand moving instinctively to smooth her cap and straighten her apron. The boy had been her salvation in this place of eternal twilight, his laughter like sunlight, his trust absolute and terrifying. At 7 years old, he should have been running through green fields, not confined to these ancient stones. She'd never been told why a human child lived in the Vampire King's castle, why he was kept in comfortable rooms but never allowed to leave, why certain members of the court watched him with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She only knew that she would protect him, had to protect him. After what she'd failed to do before, Mildred pushed open the heavy oak door, and her world tilted. "Josh?" Her voice emerged as a whisper. The chamber lay empty. His bed sat neatly made, the crimson coverlet smooth and undisturbed. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, suggesting hours had passed since anyone tended it. Moonlight spilled through the narrow window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. And there, in the center of the floor, where light and shadow met, lay Josh's wooden knight, the toy he'd carved himself from a scrap of oak, the one he carried everywhere, the one he'd been clutching just that morning when she'd braided his dark hair and promised she'd return before bedtime to read him another chapter of his favorite tale. Mildred's legs carried her forward, though her mind had gone numb. She knelt and picked up the small figure, her thumb tracing the rough edges where Josh's young hands had whittled. The knight's painted face stared up at her, accusatory. "You promised to keep him safe." "Josh?" She said it louder now, desperate, moving through the room with mounting panic. She checked behind the curtains, under the bed, inside the carved wardrobe where he sometimes hid during their games. Nothing. The wash basin still held water from his evening ablutions. His nightshirt lay folded on the chair. Everything in place except the child himself. The window. She rushed to it, her heart hammering. Closed and latched from the inside, just as she'd left it that morning. The drop to the courtyard below was 40 feet of sheer stone wall. No child could have climbed down, and even if he had, the iron gate would have stopped him. Unless someone had helped him, unless someone had taken him. No, Mildred breathed, the word becoming a mantra. No, no, no. The sound of boots on stone froze her where she stood. Multiple footsteps, moving with purpose and speed. She turned to face the doorway as 3 of the castle guard entered, their expressions grim beneath polished helmets. Behind them, moving with the fluid grace that marked his kind, came Lord Riskel, the Vampire King's right hand, pale and beautiful and merciless. His eyes, dark as the spaces between stars, fixed on Mildred with terrible focus. "The boy," he said, his voice like silk drawn across a blade's edge. "Where is he?" Mildred's throat had closed. She held up the wooden knight with a trembling hand, the only answer she could give. Riskel moved so quickly she didn't see him cross the room. One moment he stood in the doorway, the next his cold fingers gripped her wrist, forcing her to drop the toy. It clattered to the floor between them, such a small sound to mark the end of everything. "You were responsible for him." Each word carried the weight of a death sentence. "You were the last to see him, and now Lord Josh has vanished from a locked room in the heart of His Majesty's domain." "I didn't," Mildred's voice cracked. "I would never. Please, you must believe me." "What I believe is irrelevant." Riskel released her wrist and stepped back, nodding to the guards. "The Vampire King will determine your fate, and pray, Nanny, that the boy is found quickly." His lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "His Majesty's mercy has been known to expire with remarkable speed." They dragged her from the room, her protests echoing uselessly against ancient stone. As they descended into the castle's depths, Mildred's mind raced through impossibilities and horror. Josh was gone, vanished, and she would burn for it. Or worse, far worse, in a castle ruled by creatures who found death too simple a punishment. The throne room doors opened before her like the gates of hell itself, and Mildred was thrust forward into firelight and shadow to face the Vampire King's judgment, knowing that every second she spent defending herself was another second that Josh remained lost in the darkness, knowing that she had failed again, and this time the cost would be measured in a child's blood. The memory came to Mildred in fragments as the guards shoved her into her quarters and turned the key with a sound like breaking bones. 8 hours earlier, she'd found Josh in the library again, curled in the window seat with a book far too advanced for a 7-year-old, his small fingers tracing words he couldn't possibly understand. The afternoon light, what little penetrated the perpetual gloom of Castle Noctis, had caught in his dark hair, and for a moment he'd looked so much like the portrait in the king's private gallery that her breath had caught. "What are you reading, little scholar?" She'd kept her voice light, though her heart had twisted at the sight of him, so alone in this vast prison of stone and shadow. Josh had looked up with those enormous gray eyes that seemed to carry centuries they hadn't lived. "It's about bloodlines, Mildred, about how sometimes a child can belong to 2 worlds. His voice had dropped to a whisper. "Do you think that's true? Can someone be both light and dark?" She'd sat beside him then, drawing him close despite the rules against such familiarity. "I think," she'd said carefully, "that you are exactly who you're meant to be, and that's enough." He'd nestled against her shoulder, and she'd felt the small, steady beat of his heart. So fragile, so human, in this place where hearts rarely beat at all. "The other servants say I'm cursed, that I'm the reason the sun doesn't shine here anymore." His voice trembled. "They say the Vampire King keeps me because of a bargain, and one day the debt will come due." Mildred had gripped him tighter, rage and terror warring in her chest. She'd come to Castle Noctis 6 months ago, fleeing her own demons. Creditors who'd wanted more than money. A sister's death she couldn't prevent. Guilt that ate at her like rot. She'd thought herself beyond redemption until she'd met this strange, solemn child who trusted her completely, despite having every reason to trust no one. Listen to me. She'd tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet her eyes. Whatever happens, whatever they say, I will keep you safe. Do you understand? I won't let anything happen to you. Josh had studied her face with that unnerving intensity. You promise? Even though you're scared too? Especially because I'm scared. She'd managed a smile. The brave aren't fearless, Josh. They're just the ones who act anyway. The evening had passed too quickly after that. She'd walked him to his chambers as twilight bled into true darkness, and the castle stirred to its nocturnal life. He'd chattered about a dream he'd had, something about a red moon and a woman with silver eyes who'd told him he was meant for great things. Mildred had tried not to let her unease show. The court had been whispering lately, gathering in corners, watching Josh with an hunger that went beyond the usual vampiric thirst. She'd helped him into his nightshirt, braided his hair the way he liked, and read 3 chapters from his adventure book instead of the usual one. When she'd finally tucked the coverlet around his small frame, Josh had clutched his wooden knight and looked up at her with sudden desperation. Stay a little longer? His voice had been so small. Please. I have to help with the evening preparations, sweet one, but I'll be back before you know it. She'd kissed his forehead, breathed in the soap and honey scent of him. Sleep now. Dream of green fields and bright skies. Will I ever see them? The green fields? The question had pierced her. Yes, she'd lied, or hoped, or prayed. I promise. She'd left him there, safe in his bed, the firelight painting dancing shadows on the walls. She'd pulled his door closed and descended to her duties, to the head housekeeper's endless instructions about the court assembly, to the mundane tasks that had kept her from returning for one more hour. Then, too, kept her from him when he'd needed her most. Now, Mildred pressed her forehead against the locked door of her quarters, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Josh was gone, taken from a locked room while she'd been polishing silver and folding linens like any of it mattered. The Vampire King would summon her at midnight. Lord Riskel had made that clear, and she would have no answers. Only guilt and a wooden knight that grew heavier in her apron pocket with each passing moment. But she couldn't wait for midnight, couldn't sit here while Josh was somewhere in this cursed castle, frightened and alone. Every instinct screamed that time was the enemy, that whatever had taken him had done so with purpose and dark intent. Mildred moved to her window and looked down at the 40-foot drop to the courtyard below. The ancient ivy that climbed the walls looked thick enough, perhaps, to hold her weight. She'd promised to keep him safe. She'd promised she wouldn't let fear stop her. And Mildred had failed enough children for one lifetime. She began tearing her bedsheets into strips, her hand steady despite the terror singing in her veins. Somewhere in this castle of shadows and blood, Josh was waiting for her to remember what it meant to be brave. She would not fail him too. The ivy held, barely. Mildred's fingers were raw and bleeding by the time she dropped the last 6 feet into the shadowed courtyard, landing hard enough to jar her teeth. She pressed herself against the wall, listening for the guards' patrol, counting heartbeats until their footsteps faded around the eastern tower. Then she ran. The servants' entrance stood unguarded. Everyone was preparing for the midnight assembly. Mildred slipped inside and moved through the narrow passages she knew by heart, her mind racing through possibilities. Josh loved to explore, had shown her secret places he'd discovered, in his lonely wanderings. If someone had lured him, they would have used his curiosity against him. She found the scullery maid first, a girl named Anne, who sometimes played cards with Josh in the kitchen. The girl's face went white when Mildred grabbed her arm. "The young master. Did you see him this evening? Did he come down to the kitchens?" Anne shook her head violently, terror making her mute. But her eyes flickered toward the old pantry, the one that hadn't been used in decades, and Mildred understood. She released the girl and moved toward it, her pulse thundering. The pantry door stood slightly ajar. Inside, behind rotting shelves, she found what Josh had shown her weeks ago. A narrow opening in the stone, child-sized, leading into darkness. He'd called it his secret kingdom, had made her promise not to tell the other servants. She'd made him promise never to go far inside. Mildred lit a candle from the kitchen and squeezed through the gap, her gray skirts catching on rough stone. The passage beyond descended steeply, walls slick with moisture, and something darker. She followed it down, into the castle's buried heart, where even the servants feared to go. The crypts opened before her like a mouth full of broken teeth. Ancient tombs lined the walls, their carved faces worn smooth by centuries. The air tasted of earth and old blood, and something sweeter. Decay with a sickly perfume overlay. Mildred's candle flame guttered in a draft that seemed to breathe. "Lost, little mouse?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Mildred spun, her candle revealing a figure chained to the far wall. A vampire, ancient and terrible. His beauty marred by silver burns where the enchanted bonds touched his flesh. His eyes gleamed like poisoned honey in the darkness. "I'm looking for the boy," Mildred said, forcing steel into her voice. "Josh, have you seen him?" The vampire, Remus, she'd heard whispers of him. The king's bastard brother, imprisoned a century ago for treason, tilted his head with inhuman grace. "The little prince? Oh yes, I heard him pass some hours ago. Not alone, I think. There were footsteps, voices whispering of prophecies and blood moons. His smile revealed fangs like daggers. But information has a price in this place, Mouse. A few drops of that sweet mortal blood, and I'll tell you everything." "No." Mildred stepped back, though every instinct screamed to give him what he wanted. She'd seen what happened to servants who traded blood with the imprisoned ones. They became hollow things, addicted, eventually drained. Remus laughed, the sound like wind through a graveyard. "Brave and foolish. Very well. I'll give you one truth for free, because I enjoy chaos." He leaned forward until his chains went taut. "Lady Vexlin covets more than the throne, Mouse. She covets the boy's destiny. In 3 nights, the blood moon rises, and whoever controls the child controls the future of our kind. The king's court is divided, and little Josh is the key to everything." Where did they take him? "That would require payment." His eyes fixed on her throat. "But I'll offer you this. Seek the eastern passage, the one that leads beyond the castle walls. You'll find what remains of his courage there." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Hurry, Mouse. The boy has until the blood moon. After that, he becomes something else entirely. Something that won't remember his name, or yours." Mildred ran, Remus's laughter chasing her through the crypts. The eastern passage was older than the rest, its stones carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. And there, caught on a jagged edge where the tunnel bent toward freedom, she found it. A strip of torn fabric, blue cotton stained with dirt. Josh's shirt. The one she'd mended just yesterday, her needle pulling thread through the small rip he'd gotten climbing the garden wall. He'd been here, been dragged or led through this passage that led God's knew where beyond the castle's protection. And she had 3 nights to find him before whatever prophecy Lady Vexland served consumed him completely. Mildred clutched the torn fabric to her chest, feeling the weight of impossible odds. But she'd climbed down ivy despite her fear. She'd faced a chained vampire in the dark, and she would walk into hell itself if that's what it took, because Josh believed she was brave, and she would not prove him wrong. The eastern passage twisted like a serpent's spine, leading Mildred not outward as she'd expected, but deeper into the castle's forgotten places. She emerged finally into a chamber that stole her breath, a library hidden behind centuries of dust and deliberate obscurity. Its shelves, towering into shadows, the candlelight couldn't penetrate. Books lined every surface, some bound in leather that looked disturbingly like skin, others chained to their shelves as though the knowledge within might escape. Mildred moved among them with growing desperation, searching for anything that might explain Josh's significance, why Lady Vexland would risk the king's wrath to take him. She found it in a tome that fell open at her touch, as though it had been waiting. The pages were illuminated with blood-red ink, depicting a child standing between a dying sun and a crimson moon. The text beneath made her hands shake. When the blood moon rises in its appointed hour, the child of 2 worlds shall choose the fate of night eternal. Through his veins runs the power to destroy the darkness or sanctify it. He who commands the child commands the future. He who kills the child preserves the past. 2 worlds, light and dark. Josh's words from the library returned to her with devastating clarity. Can someone be both? She turned pages with trembling fingers, finding more. Josh wasn't just any child. He was the vampire king's son, born of a human mother who died bringing him into the world, half mortal, half immortal, carrying in his fragile body the power to either end the vampire curse or make it absolute. In 3 nights, when the blood moon reached its apex, that power would manifest, and whoever controlled him in that moment would reshape reality itself. So you found my shame and my salvation. Mildred spun, the book tumbling from her grasp. The vampire king stood in the doorway, and even in the dim light she could see something was terribly wrong. His face, usually pale as marble, had taken on a grayish cast. His movements, normally fluid as water, held a tremor. "Your Majesty, She dropped into a curtsy born of instinct and terror. "Dispense with formalities, Mildred." His voice carried the weight of ages and exhaustion. "You've climbed down walls and braved my brother's madness to find my son. You've earned the right to stand straight in my presence." She rose slowly, watching him approach with unsteady steps. "You're dying. Poisoned." A bitter smile crossed his ancient features. "Wolfsbane in my evening blood, administered by someone close enough to access my private stores. I have perhaps 2 days before the toxin reaches my heart." He gestured to the book at her feet. "I kept Josh here, not as a prisoner, but as protection. The court has long debated whether to use him or destroy him. I thought I could keep them in balance until he was old enough to choose his own path. Lady Vexland wants to use him to make our curse permanent, to ensure vampires rule eternal night. Others want him dead before the prophecy can manifest, preferring the devil they know to the uncertainty he represents." The king's legs seemed to give way. He caught himself against a shelf. "And I'm too weak to stop any of them." Mildred's mind raced. "Tell me where she's taken him. I'll bring him back." "You?" The word wasn't cruel, merely realistic. A mortal woman against Lady Vexland's power? You'd be ash before you crossed her threshold. He studied her with eyes that had witnessed empires rise and fall. Unless you weren't mortal anymore. The air between them seemed to crystallize. What are you offering? A vampire's oath. My blood and power, bound to you through ancient magic. You would have the strength to face what's coming. Speed, resilience, heightened senses. Enough to stand against Vexlin's forces. He paused, and something almost like compassion crossed his dying face. But you would be bound to this realm forever. Neither fully mortal nor truly vampire. Changed, Mildred. Irrevocably. She thought of Josh's gray eyes, his small hand in hers, his voice asking if someone could belong to two worlds. She thought of her sister, dead because Mildred had been too weak to save her, too afraid to act until it was too late. Will it be enough to save him? I don't know, the king admitted, but it's the only chance either of you have. 3 nights until the blood moon. 3 nights until Josh became either salvation or apocalypse. And she was the only one who could reach him in time. Do it, Mildred whispered. The vampire king moved with sudden grace despite his weakness, taking her wrist in his cold hand. This will hurt, he said almost gently. And you will never be the same. His fangs pierced her flesh, and Mildred's scream echoed through the forgotten library. Fire and ice poured through her veins as ancient magic rewrote what it meant to be human. She felt her heart stutter, felt something dark and powerful flood into the spaces where only mortality had lived before. When he released her, she collapsed to her knees, gasping. But her vision had sharpened, the shadows no longer absolute. She could hear the guards 3 floors above, smell the decay in the castle's foundations, feel the pulse of power thrumming through stone, and the vampire king swayed, the oath having cost him dearly. Find my son, Mildred, before Vexlin uses him to damn us all. She rose on legs that felt strange and new, strong in ways that terrified her. I will. I swear it. And she meant it with every transformed fiber of her being. The eastern gate stood unguarded, its iron twisted open as though something massive had forced passage. Beyond it, the dark wood stretched like a wound in the world. Trees so ancient their branches wove a canopy that even moonlight couldn't penetrate. Mildred paused at the threshold, her new senses screaming warnings her human mind struggled to interpret. She could smell Josh now, a faint trace of honey soap and child sweat, hours old, but clear as a beacon to her transformed perception. The trail led into the forest's throat, and she followed it despite every instinct howling at her to flee. The dark wood was older than the castle, older than the vampire curse itself. Things lived here that predated humanity's brief reign, and they did not welcome intruders. Mildred had walked perhaps 100 yards when the wraiths found her. They came as whispers first, then as shapes that hurt to perceive directly, creatures of rage and hunger that had forgotten what it meant to be anything else. One lunged, and Mildred moved without thinking, her body responding with speed that defied nature. She dodged, rolled, came up running as the wraiths shrieked behind her. But they were relentless. One caught her shoulder, its touch burning like frozen fire. Pain exploded through her, and with it came visions. Her sister Emma, 5 years old, drowning in the river while Mildred stood frozen on the bank, too afraid to jump in, too weak to save her. The water closing over Emma's terrified face as their mother's screams echoed from the house. No! Mildred gasped, tearing free. The wraith's touch had left blackened marks on her skin, but she forced herself forward. Josh needed her. She couldn't fail again. The blood vines came next, erupting from the soil like seeking fingers. They wrapped around her ankles, her waist, thorns piercing through fabric to taste her transformed blood. Where they touched, they showed her more failures. Children in the village she'd worked, hungry and desperate, while she'd spent their food money on drink to forget Emma's death. Their hollow eyes accusing her of selfishness, of cowardice. She screamed, ripping free with strength that surprised her, leaving strips of her gray dress behind. The vines writhed, disappointed, as she stumbled onward. Then came the mists. They rolled through the trees like something alive, carrying with them Mildred's deepest terrors given form. Emma appeared before her, bloated and rotted, river water streaming from her mouth. "You let me die," the thing that wore her sister's face hissed, "and now you'll let the boy die too, because that's what you do, Mildred. You fail. You're not real." But Mildred's voice broke. Her new power meant nothing against the guilt that had driven her to Castle Noctis in the first place, the worthlessness that sang in her bones. Emma's corpse reached for her with waterlogged hands. "He trusted you, just like I trusted you. And you'll stand frozen again while he drowns in darkness. No!" The word tore from Mildred's throat. "I'm not that person anymore. I won't be." She thought of Josh's laugh, bright as bells in the castle's gloom, his small hand in hers, his voice asking if she was brave, the way he'd looked at her with absolute faith, as though she was worth believing in. The mist recoiled as Mildred pushed through it, tears streaming down her face. "I'm coming, Josh. I promise. I'm coming." The forest opened suddenly into a clearing where a woodsman's cottage stood abandoned, its door hanging loose. Mildred's enhanced vision picked out details, even in the darkness. Fresh disturbance in the dust, a cup still wet with water. Coals in the hearth not yet cold. And there, just inside the doorway, Josh's other shoe. She knelt, touching it with trembling fingers. The leather was scuffed but intact. He'd lost it recently, perhaps in the last few hours. She was close. So close. But outside the cottage, in the soft earth, she found something that made her blood freeze. 2 sets of footprints leading away into the deeper forest. One, small, child-sized, walking steadily. The other, larger, measured, careful. Josh hadn't been dragged here. He'd walked beside his captor willingly, his stride even and unhurried, which meant he'd gone with someone he knew, someone he trusted enough to follow into the cursed wood, someone from the castle who'd betrayed them all. Mildred clutched the shoe to her chest, feeling the weight of revelation. Lady Vexlin hadn't sent monsters to steal Josh away. She'd sent someone with a familiar face, someone who'd whispered promises the boy believed. And now, deep in the dark wood where even her new powers felt fragile against ancient malice, Mildred had to find them before the blood moon rose and consumed the child she'd sworn to protect. She followed the tracks into darkness, carrying Josh's shoe like a talisman, and prayed she wasn't already too late. The footprints led Mildred to a clearing that reeked of ancient power. Standing stones ringed the space, their surfaces carved with symbols that writhed and shifted when observed directly. At the center, painted in what could only be blood, a perfect circle glowed with sickly light. And within that circle, small and terrified, stood Josh. "Mildred!" His voice cracked with relief and fear. He lunged toward her, but rebounded off the circle's edge as though striking glass. "I can't get out. Please." Well, Lady Vexlin emerged from behind one of the stones, her silver gown flowing like liquid moonlight. She was beautiful in the way of poisonous things, her smile revealing fangs like pearls. The little mouse has found her way to the trap. How delightfully predictable. Mildred's new senses cataloged everything. Vexlin's position, the ritual components scattered around the stones, the blood moon just beginning to crest the tree line. 2 nights had passed in her journey through the dark wood, time flowing strangely under the cursed canopy. She had perhaps an hour before the prophecy's moment arrived. "Let him go," Mildred said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your quarrel is with the king, not an innocent child." "Innocent!" Vexlin laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. "He's the key to everything, dear Mildred. And thanks to my associate's careful planning, he's exactly where he needs to be." A figure stepped from the shadows behind Josh's circle, and Mildred's world tilted sickeningly. Master Edwin, Josh's tutor, the gentle scholar who'd taught the boy letters and numbers, who'd shared tea with Mildred in the library and spoken of better worlds beyond the castle's darkness. His weathered face looked apologetic, but determined. "I'm sorry you had to see this," Edwin said, his voice carrying the same kindly tone he'd used to explain mathematical principles to Josh. "Truly I am. You were never meant to make it this far." "You?" The word emerged as a whisper. "Josh trusted you. He loved you like a grandfather, yes." Edwin's expression flickered with something that might have been genuine regret. "And I care for the boy in my way. But immortality, Mildred, true immortality, not the cursed half-life of vampires, that's what Lady Vexlin has promised me. When the ritual completes, Josh's power will flow through me, and I'll live forever in the sunlight, not shadows." Josh pressed against the circle's edge, tears streaming down his face. "Master Edwin, please, you said you'd show me the ritual stones, that they were important history. And they are, child. You're about to become the most important part of that history." Edwin turned to Mildred, and his eyes held a calculation that made her skin crawl. "Did you never wonder why you, of all people, were hired? A woman with no references, fleeing debt and guilt, perfect for taking the blame when the boy inevitably vanished?" The words hit like physical blows. You planned this from the beginning?" "I recommended you to the steward myself." Edwin's smile was almost pitying. "Your sister's death haunts you so profoundly that you broadcast guilt like a beacon. The perfect scapegoat, so eager to prove yourself worthy, so desperate to save this child to atone for the one you couldn't save. When Josh disappeared, who would the court suspect but the damaged, desperate woman who'd failed before?" Mildred's hands clenched into fists. The vampire's oath thrummed through her veins, begging for release, for violence. "I won't let you do this. You won't stop us either." Vexlin moved with liquid grace, positioning herself at one of the cardinal points around Josh's circle. "The king gave you a taste of power, but you're barely hours transformed. I've had centuries to perfect my craft." Mildred lunged anyway, because Josh was crying, and the blood moon was rising, and she'd be damned twice over before she let them use him. She moved faster than human thought, but Vexlin was faster still. The vampire's backhand caught Mildred across the face with the force of a sledgehammer, sending her tumbling across the clearing. Pain exploded through her skull. She tried to rise, but Vexlin was already there, pinning her to the ground with one elegant hand around her throat. "You should have stayed in your locked room," the vampire purred. "At least then you'd have died quickly." Through dimming vision, Mildred saw Edwin begin the chant, his voice resonating with power borrowed from dark sources. The blood moon cleared the trees, bathing the clearing in crimson light. Josh screamed, his small body beginning to glow from within as the prophecy stirred to waking. Mildred clawed at Vexlin's grip, her transformed strength useless against centuries of vampiric power. The edges of her vision darkened. She'd failed again. Failed Emma. Failed Josh. Failed everyone who'd ever trusted her. The blood moon reached its apex, and Josh's screams became something else, a sound of transformation, of power erupting from mortal flesh. And Mildred, dying in the dirt, could only watch as the prophecy began to unfold. "Mildred!" Josh's voice cut through the darkness, swallowing her consciousness. "Mildred, please, don't leave me." The words pierced deeper than Vexlin's grip ever could. Mildred had heard that same desperate plea before, from Emma's lips as the river claimed her. She'd frozen then, paralyzed by fear, while her sister drowned. Not again. Never again. The vampire's oath exploded to life inside her, responding to her desperate need. She felt the Vampire King's power surge through their bond, not just the remnants he'd given her, but everything left in his dying body. His final gift, burning through her veins like liquid starlight. Mildred's eyes snapped open, blazing with borrowed power. Her hand shot up, catching Vexlin's wrist before the vampire could react. "Get off!" She threw Vexlin across the clearing with strength that shocked them both. The ancient vampire crashed into a standing stone hard enough to crack it, her silver dress staining red from the impact. Mildred rose, her body smoking with power that wouldn't last long. She could feel the king's life ebbing with each heartbeat. He was giving her everything, burning himself out completely to grant her this chance. Minutes, maybe less, before it all faded. She had to make them count. 3 of Vexlin's vampire servants emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted with hunger and malice. Mildred met them with a ferocity born not of power, but of pure maternal rage. She dodged the first's lunge, using his momentum to slam him into the second. The third came at her from behind, but she'd heard his approach, her enhanced senses cataloging every breath, every footfall. She spun, driving her fist through his chest with precision that surprised her. He crumbled to ash, and she was already moving, because Edwin's chanting had grown louder, more desperate. The ritual was reaching its crescendo, Josh's small body convulsing as power tore through him. Mildred crashed into Edwin like a hurricane, breaking his concentration. The old scholar stumbled, his chant faltering, and the blood circle's glow flickered uncertainly. "No!" Edwin's face twisted with rage and desperation. "I was so close. Centuries of planning." He pulled a dagger from his robes, the blade inscribed with the same writhing symbols as the standing stones. Not meant for Mildred, she realized with horror. Meant for Josh. If Edwin couldn't harness the prophecy, he'd destroy it, and the boy with it. Vexlin had risen, her elegant face now a mask of inhuman fury. She moved toward Josh's circle with lethal intent. Edwin raised the ritual blade, his eyes fixed on the helpless child. Mildred stood between them, her power already beginning to fade. She could feel the king's death through their bond. He had seconds left, no more. And she had a choice that would define everything. Kill Edwin first, ensure he could never complete the ritual, but give Vexlin time to reach Josh. Or save Josh now, risk Edwin finishing the spell, but at least the boy would be in her arms. Emma's waterlogged face flashed through her mind, accusing. Josh's gray eyes met hers, filled with terror and trust in equal measure. Mildred chose love over vengeance. She lunged for the circle, her fingers breaking through its barrier with the last surge of the king's dying power. The blood magic shattered like glass, and she grabbed Josh, pulling him against her chest as the ritual collapsed around them. "I've got you," she gasped into his hair. "I've got you." "Sweet one," Edwin screamed in frustration, raising the dagger for a final desperate strike. Vexlin blurred toward them, fangs extended, ready to tear them both apart. And Josh, beautiful, innocent Josh, threw his arms around Mildred's neck and whispered, "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't leave me." The blood moon hit its apex. The prophecy activated, but not as Vexlin had planned, not as anyone had planned. It responded to the bond between nanny and child, to love freely given and trust earned through countless bedtime stories and braided hair and promises kept. Josh's power didn't flow into Edwin's ritual or Vexlin's ambition. It flowed into Mildred, and through her, into the truth of what they were together. Protector and protected. Broken woman and innocent child. Two souls who'd saved each other from darkness. Light erupted from where they embraced, pure and terrible and beautiful. Not the cold light of vampires or the crimson glow of blood magic, but something older and more fundamental, the light of a promise kept, of redemption earned, of love that refused to fail, twice. Edwin's scream cut short as the light consumed him, burning away centuries of ambition and betrayal. Vexlin's ancient body crumbled to ash, her schemes undone by something she'd never understood. That true power came not from domination, but from sacrifice. The light faded slowly, leaving Mildred kneeling in the clearing with Josh still clutched in her arms. The blood moon had passed, the standing stones lay broken, and somehow, impossibly, they were both still breathing. "Are you okay?" Josh whispered, his small hands touching her face. "You're crying." "I'm fine," Mildred managed, though tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm perfect. We're going home." Through the fading bond, she felt the Vampire King's final satisfaction. Then nothing. He was gone, his power spent, but his son was safe. And Mildred had finally saved the child she'd sworn to protect. The castle felt different as Mildred carried Josh through its gates. The oppressive darkness that had always clung to the ancient stones seemed lighter somehow, as though the very walls sensed the shift in fate. Servants emerged from doorways, their faces reflecting wonder and fear as they beheld the nanny who'd ventured into the dark wood and returned with the prophesied child alive. Lord Riskel met them in the great hall, his expression unreadable. "The king wishes to see you both," he said quietly. "What remains of him?" They found the Vampire King in his chambers, propped among silk pillows that seemed to swallow his withered frame. The poison and the power he'd given Mildred had reduced him to something barely corporeal. But his ancient eyes still held awareness, and when he saw Josh, something like joy crossed his dying face. "My son," he whispered. Josh pulled free from Mildred's arms and ran to the bedside, his small hands grasping his father's cold fingers. "Papa, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone with Master Edwin." "Hush, child." The king's voice was barely audible. "You trusted, as children should. The fault was mine for not seeing the viper in my court." His gaze shifted to Mildred. "But you did what I could not. You saved him." "The prophecy," Mildred began, uncertain. "What does it mean?" "What happens now?" A faint smile touched the king's lips. "Feel it yourself. The bond between you." Mildred closed her eyes and reached inward, sensing the thread that connected her to Josh. It pulsed with warm light, not the cold power of vampires, but something gentler. Through it, she felt Josh's emotions, his relief and sorrow, and the strange new awareness blooming inside him. The prophecy was never about destruction or domination, the king explained, his words coming slower now. It was about balance. Josh carries both light and darkness within him. Through your bond, forged in love, not ritual, he will slowly transform this realm, not destroying the vampires, but healing them, returning what was lost when the curse first fell. Healing them how? Mildred asked. Choice. The king's breathing rattled. For centuries, we've been locked in eternal night, slaves to blood and shadow. Josh will give my kind the ability to choose, to remain as we are, or to reclaim some measure of the humanity we lost. It will take years, perhaps decades, but change has begun. He turned his fading gaze to Mildred. The oath I gave you, it's transformed through the prophecy. You're no longer bound as my servant, but as Josh's guardian, a bridge between mortal and immortal, human and vampire. You'll age more slowly than others, live long enough to see him grown and safe, and you'll have a place here if you choose to stay. Mildred looked at Josh, who watched her with those enormous gray eyes. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly. Not without him. Good. The vampire king's eyes began to close. Then I can rest. Lord Riskel will serve as regent until Josh comes of age. And you, Mildred, you'll ensure he grows up knowing love, not just power. That's more important than any prophecy. His final breath whispered out like wind through autumn leaves, and then he was still. Josh buried his face in Mildred's shoulder and wept, and she held him while the castle mourned its king. The days that followed were a blur of ceremony and transition. Lord Riskel proved surprisingly honorable, accepting Mildred's role without question. The servants who'd once looked through her now treated her with cautious respect. Lady Vexlin's faction had crumbled with her death, and those who remained swore loyalty to the young prince. But the most extraordinary thing happened on the third morning after their return. Mildred woke to find sunlight streaming through her window. Real sunlight, warm and golden, the first the castle had seen in a century. Throughout the halls, she heard gasps of wonder and fear as vampires encountered daylight that didn't burn, that touched their skin with warmth instead of agony. The healing had begun. That evening, Mildred sat in Josh's repaired chamber, reading from his adventure book while he nestled against her shoulder. The torn fabric of his favorite shirt had been mended. His wooden knight sat on the nightstand keeping watch. Outside the door, guards she'd personally selected stood ready, not to keep Josh prisoner, but to ensure no one disturbed his rest. Mildred? Josh's voice was sleepy. Are you happy here? She considered the question, remembering the woman who'd fled to Castle Noctis 6 months ago, desperate, guilt-ridden, running from Emma's death and her own failures. That woman seemed like a stranger now. Yes, she said honestly, I am. Good, because I want you to stay forever. Then forever it is. She tucked the coverlet around him and moved to the window, looking out at the castle grounds. In the glass, her reflection caught her eye. Still recognizably herself, but changed. Her eyes held a faint luminescence in the dim light, a reminder of the vampire's oath. Her features seemed sharper, more defined. But it was her expression that struck her most. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she looked at peace. Behind her, Josh's breathing deepened into sleep, his small hand curled around his wooden knight. And on the horizon, impossible and beautiful, the first true dawn in 100 years painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Mildred smiled and let the light wash over her face. She was no longer running from her past. She was building a future, and this time, she wouldn't fail.